Well, one day I was sleeping off a hangover on a Sunday morning, and she was getting ready to go to church. And she looked at me and she said, "Why don't you come to church with me today?" And I thought, I'm going to go and see if I could rescue her from this cult.
Don't say yourself short, try and live in the moment. Fireworks come and go. And when it all fades away like seasons, do tell me, what will you have to show?
Lee Strobel's plan to rescue his wife didn't go quite the way he planned. God sent him on a journey to explore the credibility of Jesus. And although Lee thought it would distance him from God, it actually brought him right into a relationship with Jesus Christ. This is GPS, God, People, Stories. I'm Jim Kirkland.
And I'm Phil Fleischman. As we get ready to celebrate Easter later this week, a lot of people will have the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ on their minds. And Lee says that the resurrection was one of the biggest issues to work through as he tried to disprove Christianity. Billy Graham knew that the resurrection is central to the Christian faith.
Ladies and gentlemen, if I did not believe that Christ bodily rose from the grave, I would quit preaching.
You'll hear Billy Graham talk more about the resurrection of Jesus Christ in a little bit here on this episode. Without the resurrection, Christianity would be a hopeless religion. But because of the resurrection, you can find true hope and peace when you have a relationship with Jesus. We can tell you more of this at findpeacewithgod.net. That's findpeacewithgod.net.
Oh, hey, one more thing before we get started. GPS is going on a little hiatus. Now, in the meantime, there are still a lot of episodes of this podcast you can listen to, like more than 5 years worth. So while GPS might be taking a little break, it does not mean that you have to.
Oh, not at all. We have a lot of other content you can listen to and engage with. For example, Sissy Graham Lynch's podcast, Fearless. You can also listen to hundreds of Billy Graham's sermons at the Billy Graham Audio Archives. And a fine way to stay connected with all of this content and to get word when GPS is returning is by following us on Facebook. Just search for Billy Graham Radio or use the link that we have in the show notes.
GPS. God. People. Stories.
My parents went to a mainline denominational church. And my mom definitely had a born-again experience as a teenager. I believe my father was a believer, but they were very private and personal about their faith. And they decided to leave it to me, whatever decision I would make in terms of my own belief system.
The decision Lee Strobel would eventually make was to believe that God doesn't exist.
And so there were 3 steps that led me into atheism. The first one was in junior high school when I began asking the tough questions that young people ask. How can there be a loving God if there's so much pain in the world? Well, how could a loving God send people to hell? And nobody was really willing to engage me on those issues. So I concluded there are no good answers. And then in high school, taking a course in biology and being taught that Darwinism explains the origin and diversity of life, I figured that puts God out of a job. And then in college, taking a course on the historical Jesus taught by a skeptic that taught me you can't trust the Gospels. And so that cemented me into my atheism.
Lee attended 2 of the most respected colleges in the country, and then he landed a job at one of the most respected newspapers in the country.
My background's in journalism and law, so I tend to be a skeptical person. It's kind of woven into my DNA. Went to Yale Law School for a Master of Studies in Law degree and journalism school at the University of Missouri, and I was legal editor of the Chicago Tribune.
By the time Lee began working at the Tribune, he was married to his high school sweetheart. Her name is Leslie. She wasn't a dyed-in-the-wool atheist like Lee, but she wasn't a follower of Jesus either.
She kind of always believed in God, didn't quite understand how Jesus fit in the picture. It was just kind of a puzzle, like a jigsaw puzzle that wasn't put together yet. And it was through a friendship with a Christian nurse who we met, who became her best friend, who shared Jesus with her and brought her to church, that over time she heard the gospel and understood that Jesus is the unique Son of God, and that it's through him that we can be forgiven of our sins and adopted into his family.
That happened when Lee and Leslie were in their mid-20s. Lee says it led to the most stressful and difficult period of their marriage.
we're at odds on things we never used to be at odds about. How to raise our children, how to spend our weekends, how to spend our money. She wanted to give money to the church. I thought that was, might as well just flush it down the toilet. She wanted to go to church on weekends. I wanted to, go out drinking on Saturday night and sleep off my hangover on Sunday morning. She wanted to help train the children in faith, and I didn't want them to become Christians because then I thought they would think less of their dad, who's not a Christian.
There's one incident in particular that's a good example of the turmoil Lee was experiencing because of Leslie's new faith.
When she first told me that she had become a Christian, I was so mad. I went out and she had planted a beautiful flower garden in our backyard, and I was cutting the lawn, and I just mowed down her whole flower garden just in frustration over the whole situation. So there was a lot of angst over those 2 years when we were spiritually mismatched.
At first, Lee thought about divorce, but he loved Leslie, and he couldn't deny the positive changes he was seeing in her. He says there was a push and pull going on.
The positive changes in her values and character attracted me toward the faith. At the same time, it made me angry. And it made me angry because it was as if she was holding up a mirror. And I was seeing in the contrast between my life, which was corroded with sin and corruption, I was seeing the contrast between that and this increasingly holy life that Leslie was leading. And it made me face things about myself that I didn't want to face. So it wasn't that she was judging me or shaming me. Her merely living an increasingly faithful life to Jesus accentuated the ugliness of my own life and the immorality of my own behavior. And it made me angry. I didn't want to acknowledge any of that.
So how did Lee get from that place of resenting Leslie for her faith in Jesus to becoming he himself a follower of Jesus Christ?
Well, one day I was sleeping off a hangover on a Sunday morning, and she was getting ready to go to church. And she looked at me and she said, "Why don't you come to church with me today?" And I thought, I'm going to go and see if I could rescue her from this cult. So I said, I'm going to bring my reporter's notebook from the Chicago Tribune, because I said, I'm going to try to find a scandal, and that way I can, expose this church for the fraud that it is.
The pastor preached a message he called Basic Christianity.
And it was the first time, here I was almost 30 years old, living in Chicago. It was the first time I ever understood the gospel. And I walked out that day saying, number one, I didn't believe it. I was still a skeptic. But number two, I realized if this is true, this has huge implications for my life. So that's when I decided to take my legal training and journalism training and investigate it, because I knew that if Jesus had lived, he had left behind evidence of that. And I knew, just as you can investigate the writings of Josephus or Suetonius or Tacitus or any other ancient writer, you could take those same investigative techniques and apply them to the Gospels to try to determine, is it telling us the truth? Are they reporting what really happened? And so that's when I launched this investigation, thinking that I could disprove Christianity in a weekend.
Lee's investigation ended up taking a lot longer than one weekend. It took almost 2 years before he determined that he couldn't disprove Christianity or the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it really is a cumulative case. There wasn't a single thing that did it, but it was over time as I began to look. And there were really 4 areas. The first was the execution of Jesus. And was he really dead? You have to have a dead body before you can have a resurrection. So I didn't know if he was dead. And, as I researched that, I found that even the atheist New Testament scholar, Gerd Ludemann, says it's indisputable that Jesus was dead through crucifixion. Even the